Hello and welcome to the British Sitcom History Podcast. We have a bonus episode for you this week. It's Gareth here, and last year I appeared as a guest on Harry White's podcast. His podcast is called the Modern British Political History Podcast, which is quite a mouthful when you're trying to also say the British Sitcom History Podcast and not get the two mixed up. Anyway, Harry's podcast is really interesting if you're a politics nerd like I am, and he has guests on who generally talk about much more academic subjects than me. But I was a guest and we were talking about the 1980 sitcom Yes Minister, starring Paul Eddington and Nigel Hawthorne. You may remember Yes Minister. It also morphed into Yes Prime Minister. We focused on the original incarnation of Yes Minister. We talked about it in quite a lot of detail with a real emphasis on politics. Harry is a civil servant by trade, and so it was really interesting to get his insights. This is a slightly different episode in that we haven't covered Yes Minister in the same way that Alan and I would on our regular podcast, but we do have a good look at it, and it's really interesting to listen to Harry talk about how he perceived Yes Minister as a man who joined the civil service a couple of decades later. Slightly different, but I hope you enjoy it and let us know. If you'd like to give us some feedback, you can find us on Twitter or Instagram at BritComPod, or if you come onto our Facebook page, British Sitcom History Podcast, you'll find us. Let us know what you think. Enjoy.
Well, Minister, if you ask me for a straight answer, then I shall say that looking at it by and large, taking one thing with another in terms of the average of departments, then in the final analysis, it is probably true to say that at the end of the day, in general terms, you would probably find, not to put too fine a point on it, there probably wasn't very much in it one way or other, as far as I can see at this stage. And that, of course, is a quotation from Yes Minister, which we're going to be talking about today. I'm Harry White, host of the Modern British Political History podcast. And for this one, I'm really excited to be joined by my right honourable member from the British Sitcom podcast constituency, Gareth. Gareth, would you like to say hello and introduce yourself?
Hello, Harry. Thank you for having me. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm Gareth Allen. I am one of the presenters of the British Sitcom History Podcast, and we thought there was room for a crossover here with a political sitcom.
Exactly. So Gareth's going to be really helpfully answering some questions from me on the sort of sitcom angle of Yes Minister and how does it actually function as a sitcom. But I will speak to a little bit more of the historical, political element. And as a civil servant myself, we'll be able to speak towards what is this in terms of a portrayal of the civil service, particularly at the time that it was coming out in, which was early 80s. So we'll get a bit of both angles. So yeah, I'm very excited about this one, Gareth. How are you feeling for this one?
I'm really excited. Well, on our show, we obviously talk about sitcoms. That's what we do. But we do try to place them in context of their time. And we try to do a little bit of social history around the sitcoms as well. And so this is really ticking all of my boxes. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Fantastic. And I think that was one starting point I wanted to make with Yes Minister is touch a little bit on the historical element of it and see what you think about it, Gareth, to kick things off. So when I think of Yes Minister, I immediately think of a quotation from Dominic Sambrook, the historian, who talked about Britain in the 70s. And he compared it to something that you'll know very well. He compared it to Fawlty Towers. So he said Britain in the 70s felt like this place where nothing ever quite worked the way it should do. Things were dysfunctional. It had seen better days, all of that stuff. And I think a lot of that kind of thinking filters into Yes Minister, the kind of sense of what Britain was like at that time, the challenges that Britain had. What do you think in terms of how it feels in terms of its context of Yes Minister?
Well, I think the timing is fascinating because I'm 47. I remember Yes Minister and its successor, Yes Prime Minister, when I was a kid. But I think of it as how you just described as that sort of 1970s post-war consensus, Butskellism type of era where it's pre-Thatcher. That's not true. Yes Minister started in 1980. It started after Thatcher had been elected and it ran to 1982. And then it was revived as Yes Prime Minister, which we're going to focus on Yes Minister today. But it is a show of the 80s. But it doesn't feel like it, does it?
It feels like a show of the 70s from my perspective. Yeah, definitely. I suppose we should ask the initial question, which is how would you describe the show, Gareth, to someone who hasn't seen it at all?
Well, Yes Minister is a supposed inside look at a government department. It's the fictional Department of Administrative Affairs, the DAA, which is
fantastic
which
name.
is this it's gloriously meaningless, isn't it? And that's an interesting thing about Yes Minister. It mixes the civil service with the political. We see this interaction between government work and political pressure. There's a little bit of his personal life as well. But really, it's not a political show. We don't know what party Jim Hacker represents. And it's irrelevant that the clash here is between Jim Hacker, who sort of is our everyman politician representing us, and Sir Humphrey Appleby, who's the civil service apparatchik, who in the context of this drama is a delayer and an obstructor and an obfuscator, and just tries to frustrate every political progress that Jim tries to make.
If I was going to put a sort of label on Hacker, I was thinking about what you said. You're right. He is this kind of blank space, isn't he, as a character in some ways? But if there was one, then it would be maybe the type of politician that Thatcher disliked strongly in the 70s, which was the typical...
He's a wet, isn't he?
Wet.
Yeah.
Compromising, consensus making, which many will see see positives of that, but Thatcher saw strongly the negatives of that, of saying, actually, this is why Britain has been in perpetual decline since probably the end of the Second World War, she might have said, because there has not been the oomph, the drive, the passion that is needed, which whatever you say about Thatcher, she certainly definitely brought some of those elements.
Apparently this was Margaret Thatcher's favourite television programme. Which,
not surprising.
Not surprisingly, because I suspect that, anecdotally, this reflected a frustration that she felt. But I'm not sure that's a huge endorsement, because Margaret Thatcher's not legendary for her sense of humour, is she?
No, in fact, would often completely miss the point of jokes, whether, I don't know, deliberately or just accidentally. Yeah, she was quite famous for that. What, in terms of predecessors, would you see for Yes Minister? I suppose it's quite unusual, isn't it, in that it's perhaps not what you typically would think of as sitcom material. But do you see any predecessors? You know this kind of landscape better than me, Gareth.
I tell you what, Harry, it depends on how you define it. So let's define it at face value, a political sitcom. There really weren't many of this. This was pretty unique at the time. I was thinking about this before we spoke, and what I came up with was more sketch comedy. So there's that famous Beyond the Fringe where Peter Cook was impersonating Macmillan, and it was scandalous at the time. And the story is that Macmillan went to see it and was mortified by the whole thing. And I thought about Spitting Image. Spitting Image is sort of around about this time, although not before. But really, there was no sitcom that was political. There have been plenty since, of course. But when I say it depends how you define it, as I say, on face value, that's what this is. But actually, I think this is fundamentally an odd couple sitcom. You know, it's a clash between Hacker, this naive, idealistic. He's got principles, but they don't really stand up to any bad weather. And then you've got Sir Humphrey as a man of order, bridle at the suggestion he even had principles. And it's this odd couple. It's Steptoe and Son, it's Rodney and Delboy. It's, the politics is the situation, but the comedy comes from the characters.
And actually, it reminds me a little bit of The Odd Couple in terms of you've got the person who is living in the house already, has their own routines, their own way of doing things. And then often in those kind of situations, you have the sort of interloper coming into the house, don't you? I'm kind of thinking of Peep Show, for example, as one example of that.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Who just mixes it all up, totally, and much to the chagrin of the long-standing resident, which civil servants are. They're the clues in the title, permanent civil service. So they are the ones running the machinery of government throughout different persuasions of government. How well do you think it works in terms of how I have a take on this, but I'd like to hear yours as an outsider to the civil service, but also an insider on sitcoms. How well do you think it works in terms of setting and all the basic logistics? How well do you think the civil service lends itself to the world of a sitcom?
Well, on a technical basis, it lends itself very well because with a couple of exceptions, there are no outside broadcasts. It's just a couple of offices. It's a really easy set to build. And so it was probably fairly cheap to make, which is great. The BBC will have loved that. It feels like an outsider looking in. It feels like you're being shown behind a curtain. You're a civil servant, Harry. I don't have a clue what goes on in these meetings, in these departments, in these conversations. And so whilst I understand this is a fictional portrayal, it's still fascinating to see how these things might work, which again, you don't get that sense of being a fly on the wall when you watch Only Fools and Horses. It's just Council Flat in Peckham, that doesn't feel like you're getting an inside view on something. So it does have that element to it, which adds an element of intrigue.
And from an insider point of view, I think of the civil service as a place where language is key. So often you're communicating, so often you're trying to find the right form of words to persuade, to influence, to find the balance between not causing some massive fracas, but trying to make your point. And that really does quite lend itself to sitcoms, because often sitcoms are about language, aren't they? And playing with words, and all of that does seem to work quite well for it.
We should mention the writers at this point. So Anthony Jay and Jonathan Lynn wrote Yes Minister. And Jonathan Lynn is the younger of the two, and he's very much comes from a comedy background. He was in Cambridge Footlights. He was a contemporary of the Pythons and the Goodies. And, if you look at what his career was, it was writing and directing TV comedy, film comedy, and that's kind of what he did. Anthony Jay, in contrast, a little older, but he was a BBC man originally, but he sort of turned against it in later years, and he went into public relations and worked for the Conservative Party. He worked for Margaret Thatcher, essentially. He was a speechwriter for Geoffrey Howe. So you had that sort of political insider's view as well. I sensed that it was a bit of a howl of frustration for him. Yes, Minister.
I get that sense. So with Anthony Jay, that he definitely has this idea of what's called public choice theory about, well, you should see the government not just as altruistic people trying to deliver on principle, but you should see it as a series of, it's a more cynical view, but it's the one that I think influences Yes Minister. You should see it as different self-interested actors trying to get one over on the other, or trying to kind of get their own personal benefit. And that's definitely the view of the civil service we get in this, is more of that.
Can I ask you more on that? Because I'm really fascinated by that. So when you say people trying to push their own personal agenda, do you mean politicians? Do you mean people within the service? Or is the theory that everyone has their own agenda?
The theory is that any organization, the best way to look at it is to reject what might be seen as a typical way of looking at an organization, and particularly looking at governments beforehand, which would be, well, governments are going to be mainly motivated by principles, the ideology, and also by the voters who elected them. But it takes that view and goes, actually, there's less about principle and it's more about incentives and rational actors trying to maximize their own benefit essentially within the system. So that might be, to give an example, we're going to talk a bit about why is it that civil servants might be more cautious, and in this show that it shows so much caution, doesn't it? And that might partly be that there's an argument that there's less to be gained by being bolder, because there's so much to lose in terms of press blowback, massive fracas, all of that. And sometimes that, for an individual working the system, can seem like a bigger problem than the potential benefits that might be gained by if you announce some radical, very big, bold maneuver. So you see that in Yes Minister, don't you, where Hacker wants to be quite bold, quite exciting, but then there's some reluctance within the civil service. There's a sense of, we've seen X happen before and that didn't work out very well. So so that's I think often quite a big influence as well, is the feeling that politicians come with the same or similar ideas, similar answers that have been tried and not worked before, and that civil service often see their role as the ones who have to try and caution against taking those actions. But that can often lead to the frustration of politicians who want to enact whatever that they're trying to enact, and don't want always to see the hurdles around the corner.
I think that's an interesting perspective. And the narrative of Yes Minister is we're kind of on Jim Hacker's side. He's hapless, but he is banging his head up against this civil service wall. And the most extreme example I could give you here is there's a whole episode where there's a hospital that has no patients, but it's got a full administrative team, and it's the most efficient hospital in the country, and they're all really proud of it, but it's not treating anyone. And it's this adherence to policy and procedure rather than actually, what are we trying to really do here? Now, obviously that's a caricature, but I hear what you're saying about these ministers who might come in with a bold, big idea, and it does need a steadying influence. That dynamic between ideology and the steadying hand of logistics and practical reality. Yeah, absolutely. That I think that's probably necessary for our system to work.
The other argument is around incentives, that often there's not a huge amount of performance-related incentives within the civil service, and people have different ideas about this. So some would say that's all well and good, because you don't want it to be about just performance pay. You want it to be about making a difference. Civil servants should only be motivated by that. But then on the flip side, you would say, well, in private companies, the way people typically are motivated is by performance-related pay, bonuses, all of that kind of thing. So there's a good argument that many make that actually that undermotivates the civil service to take risks, to do the unexpected, because failure will have a consequence. It will have a big blowback in the press. Heads roll, but actually success, there might not be as many incentives for success. There might not be as many rewards. There are examples of very well delivered government policies, but they're not often talked about as much as the big failures. So everyone will remember the poll tax, but how many people remember the rollout of the minimum wage? Probably less. How many people remember the rollout of the smoking ban, which was actually done very smoothly and very effectively, good take up? And it also links a little bit to the press in the UK, which tend to take a more if it bleeds, it leads kind of approach to the news, and tend to be quite interested in the catastrophic failure rather than the sort of well thought through moderate success. So there's a few different kind of incentives that all come into play when you ask that question about why does the civil service sometimes look overly cautious, all those issues we see in Yes Minister. I was going to ask you about any particular sort of favourite elements that you would point to, or favourite moments maybe that we could talk about.
I like the jousting. I like the joust that is personified by Jim Hacker and Sir Humphrey Appleby. It's good writing because Hacker occasionally gets a win. But basically, the pattern is Hacker has a big idea, Sir Humphrey tries to squash it, and there's usually a bit of manipulation going on. But occasionally, Hacker gets one over on Sir Humphrey, and that's great writing to do that.
And he gets better, doesn't he? He learns how to work the system. Yeah.
He absolutely does. And there is definitely development of the characters as we go along. I think the episodes, just from a writing point of view, the episodes are really well constructed. You get sort of seeds sown early on, and there's lots of moving parts, and then they come together. There were 3 series of 7 or 8 episodes, and by the end it felt a little bit formulaic. But I, to be honest, Harry, I think that's just a symptom of watching 25 episodes in a week. I think if you were watching over 3 years, you probably wouldn't quite feel that. So I don't want to be too critical of that. I'll tell you one thing I do like, one element I really like about Yes Minister are I'm going to say the club scenes. So when Sir Humphrey is out of the office and he's doing his networking, we see John Nettleton as Sir Arnold, who's the permanent secretary of the civil service. And it feels like that's where the real business gets done. And I really enjoy those scenes. There's always this element of deviousness and machination. I really like that part of the programme.
And just on that, one question you asked me before we started, which was how accurate are some of these portrayals of the civil service? And I suspect, particularly, in the 70s and 80s, the civil service was a much less diverse kind of place, particularly in terms of number of women that feature, like most organisations, but also less civil servants from ethnic minority backgrounds, less of a representation of the country at large, more of a private school educated focus, which I think has changed, although is still not probably where it should be, because you've got a third of civil servants are private school educated compared to about 7% of the country at large. But I think that idea of the gentleman's club probably was quite a big factor of how decisions were made, partly because it was mostly men operating in that environment, and probably they also had a lot of time to go away and have a drink because you had a different kind of sexual politics where the expectation of men coming home and helping out in the house, reading the kids a bedtime story probably wasn't as much there. So you could stay home and you could stay in the gentleman's club and have a whiskey and do the real politicking.
Well, you know what? While we're on the subject, there's a really good episode, and I'm not expecting your listeners to go away and watch all these episodes as homework, but if they want to, series 3, episode 1 is called Equal Opportunities, and Hacker realizes that there's no female representation at senior level in the civil service, and so we have this character who's a guest, Eleanor Bron, in a guest role, who's a female civil servant. And the idea is that Jim wants to get her promoted as a symbol of this bold new world where women can actually work.
A radical notion.
Yeah, exactly. And so Humphrey tries to scupper this. It's all pretty unpleasant, to be honest, but a very interesting snapshot of the time. But there's a lovely punchline to the episode where Hacker wins this time, and he manages to persuade Sir Humphrey that Eleanor Bron's character can get this promotion, but when it's not her turn. But she turns it down. She's off to work in the city. She's off to work in the city and make a boatload of money, which is welcome to 1983, Minister. But she scolds Hacker for being just as patronising as Sir Humphrey. He's trying to pat her on the head and saying, off you go, there you go, there's a job for you, you're very good. And I think it's really well written. It's really well observed.
Well, quite honestly, Minister, I want a job where I don't spend endless hours circulating information that isn't relevant about subjects that don't matter to people who aren't interested. I want a job where there's achievement rather than merely activity. I'm tired of pushing paper. I want to be able to point to something and say, I did that.
I don't understand.
I know. That's why I'm leaving.
Surely not saying that the government of Britain is unimportant.
No, it's very important. It's just that I haven't met anyone who's doing it.
And I'm sure that kind of element of women entering into the service and having quite a paternalistic, patronising approach taken to them. I was, obviously not there at the time, but feels like it's very likely that was the case often. And she becomes a bit of a cipher for the the female civil servants, like having to enter into the industry. Yes.
I was going to ask you how. I think it's probably an unfair question to ask you directly. Is this realistic, or was this realistic? How would you know? It was 1980 before you were born. But perhaps a better question would be, how have things changed since that kind of paternalistic gentleman's club of the 70s and 80s? To me, as an outsider, it feels to me like the civil service is a much more modern organisation now. But I think with any large institution, be it a government department or a bank or the NHS, you have that inertia, don't you?
Yes, I think a lot of the change is similar to the rest of the work world in the UK. There's certainly a lot more women in the civil service. If you look at the stats, the last I've seen, and people who are really geeky on this sort of thing like me, the Institute for Government is a really good organisation for these kind of stats. But you've got about roughly parity in terms of men to women, female civil servants. It interestingly will differ a bit by department. I think the civil service tends to reflect what's going on in the rest of the country. One element where there's something maybe that a bit different is that I think technical skill is more valued in the civil service than it used to be. So you used to have, in the same idea of the gentleman's club, you used to have this idea that the generalist is the consummate civil servant, the Renaissance man, the man who does a little bit of this, a little bit of that, the great amateur. It's kind of a British stereotype as well. And expertise was almost frowned upon, almost seen as that's a bit parochial to have very specific expertise.
Well, Harry, there's a really good example of that, isn't there? In the show, there's a couple of episodes where Ian Lavender, who people will know from, he was Pike in Dad's Army. Ian Lavender plays a junior civil servant who is an expert. The idea is that he wants there to be defined failure parameters for projects. In other words, projects might fail rather than just being quietly forgotten. And this guy and his report are treated like radioactive waste by Sir Humphrey because they don't want that sort of expertise. And there's an absolute disaster for Sir Humphrey when this character accidentally gets to speak to the minister. I thought that was really funny. And again, I don't. Well, Harry, it's interesting what you're saying, because I thought, well, that's obviously a caricature. That's not true. But you're saying maybe it was to some extent.
If you read good reports on this type of thing, that is something that consistently has come up about lack of technical deep expertise. Too much churn in the civil service is often seen as an issue. So people moving around from one department to another too quickly. I think the churn element, if you spoke to the Institute for Government, they would say that is still a big issue. People move around too much. They don't get a kind of deep embedded knowledge of what they're working on. The technical expertise, there has been some shifts. There's been a real emphasis in the civil service over recent decades on the idea of professions, and that you learn particular deeper expertise, whether it's in finance or HR or whatever it might be. So there have been some shifts over recent decades, but I think the idea of the policy generalist hasn't quite died a death, I think it would be fair to say. And the idea of everyone just having humanities degrees, the classics degree.
I'm sure Sir Humphrey could read the Odyssey.
Sir Humphrey has a classics degree, exactly. Yeah. That I don't doubt was true, particularly at the time, that there were a lot of classics degrees from Balliol flying around. And there has been a shift in that, but actually the world of the civil service is still quite humanities degree focused.
But there's an interesting intellectual snobbery within Yes Minister. We see actually it's called Bailey College rather than Balliol, which I suspect is for libel reasons. But we see quite a lot of that Sir Humphrey at his alma mater, and there are many, many, many disparaging references to Jim Hacker's degree from the London School of Economics, which is regarded as not a place where gentlemen would go. Yeah, exactly. That sort of sets my chippiness alarms go off,
I was just going to say on humanities degrees as well, I think part of the reason why it was historically there's been so many civil servants with humanities degrees is because the civil service lends itself to being good with words and writing long tracts. So you're often trying to persuade ministers, you're often writing long reports, but there is definitely a good argument that there's been a lack of technical expertise. And there has been some shifts. There's been efforts to get more STEM subjects expertise into the civil service. And I think there's been, from my understanding, moderate success there, but there's probably still quite a ways to go, I would imagine, on that front. What about some of your least favourite elements, Gareth, in Yes Minister?
As I say, I think some of my criticism of the show might be based on the manner in which I watched it all back to back. But I found actually some of the Sir Humphrey monologues, by the end, they were starting to grate with me a little bit. So you actually used something similar at the top of the show as a quote to kick us off, and it was a perfect example of that obfuscatory language that Sir Humphrey uses. And I think, as the series progresses, the writers kind of leaned into that because it always gets a big laugh. And sometimes you can have too much of a good thing. Like if you watch the later episodes of Last of the Summer Wine, it's just three blokes in a bath rolling down a hill. You've got to, you sort of lean into the you play the hit, But overall, I like Sir Humphrey and I like his obstructionism. I like the joust. That is my favorite part of the show. But then when it's overdone a little bit, it feels a bit lumpy. The other thing that we haven't even mentioned yet, which kind of sums up why I don't like it, is the third character in this odd couple drama, which is Bernard Woolley, who is Jim's private secretary, right? I've got that right? Private secretary.
Yes. That's
so he's
right,
his kind of his body man, his assistant, is the civil servant who is closest to. Like, I understand within the civil service, I understand that role, but within the sitcom, I don't really know what he adds. It doesn't really work for me. He sort of acts as a bit of a halfway house between the two characters, but I don't know. Sometimes that's useful for moving on the narrative, but I don't know. I don't like him. Is he like the Uncle Albert of?
I wonder if he's the cipher almost for the audience, in that often he will ask the sort of ignorant questions, particularly to Sir Humphrey. He'll say, "Well, isn't it right that a politician should do X, Y, Z, should try and implement their manifesto?" And you'll get some incredibly cynical answer, incredibly Game of Thrones-esque answer from Sir Humphrey in his role.
It's not really a criticism of Derek Fowles, the actor. It's more the role. I don't know. It doesn't really. I think without him, you'd struggle. You do kind of need that person, but it just feels like it's not neither one thing nor the other. But you have just mentioned. I know you've asked me my least favourites, but I feel like I do need to say we've talked about Sir Humphrey a lot. Nigel Hawthorne, the actor who plays him, is wonderful. He is by far the best actor in this production. And that's a great example of where Bernard will ask him an impertinent question, and his reactions, his incredulity, sometimes his anger. It's really great acting. I think he's brilliant. I mean, he's obviously he's an Oscar-nominated actor, isn't he? It's not. I don't think I'm cracking a code here. Nigel Hawthorne is a good actor.
And on the obfuscating monologues, in terms of how much does that reflect the civil service? I mean, civil servants often can use flowery language, definitely. I mean, like I said, there's a pedigree of coming from humanities degrees, which often privilege using lots of quite complex, flowery, long terms, and I think some of that flows in. And there are examples to the point where there's been articles published about unnecessary terms to use if you're a civil servant. The kind of jargon that really starts to rub people up the wrong way. Those kind of slightly strange idioms like, we'll run that idea up the flagpole and see if anyone salutes it. Those kind of things. I also think there are sometimes institutional turns of phrase and verbal tics. I've got a few friends who are in the legal profession, and they all say, "Well, in my view, such and such." And I don't know anybody else who says "in my view." It's just, but it seems to be something that lawyers say. And with the flowery language, obfuscating language as well, part of that comes from a civil servant perspective, is that there's a common idea that you should be very wary, if you're a civil servant, of ever saying no to a minister or "I disagree." You should always be talking about the risks of taking policies, the benefits, but never directly, even if you are personally squeamish about the idea, never directly saying, no, I disagree. So that can sometimes lead to quite twisted kind of answers where you're sort of turning in on yourself, trying to find a way of expressing what you want to express.
I'm thinking of Sir Humphrey saying, very brave, Minister.
Very brave. Or there's bold, and then I think isn't courageous.
Courageous, yes.
I think he says something to the effect of, if you say it's bold, that might lose your seat, but if you say it's courageous, that might lose you the next general election.
Yeah. Very good.
So I was thinking about what bits I was less fond of in this as well. I think I probably already given a flavour of what some of it is, which is there definitely is, and I think it comes from Anthony J, that cynical perspective. There's a good quotation from him about Yes Minister where he said, in Yes Minister, we're showed almost everything that the government has to decide is a conflict between two lots of private interests, that of the politicians and that of the civil servants trying to advance their own careers and improve their own lives. And that's why public choice economics, which explains why all this was going on, was at the root of almost every episode of Yes Minister. So it's a very Game of Thrones-esque, very game theory-esque understanding of how institutions works, where principles don't play a huge role in it. It's much more Machiavellian than that. So
it's profoundly
it depends on what
cynical,
you think about that. It's a very cynical way of looking at it. And you wouldn't be surprised to know that I would argue that actually there is altruism and principle that comes into actors in the civil service. Of course, there is self-interest. Of course, there's a Game of Thrones-esque approach to things that can sometimes creep in. But there is also political convictions and altruism. So it comes two very different ways of viewing people and how people operate that flow into how you might think about Yes Minister. What do you think about this stuff, Gareth? I'd be interested in your view on.
Well, I mean, I've got no inside view. I know that this is not realistic, but I understand also that it is a caricature of what was realistic.
Exactly. Yes.
One would like to think that there is some altruism going on, and that people who work within the civil service, it's a career, it's a job, it's a way of earning money. But you're working in the civil service. You didn't go to work for a merchant bank. So there's an element there of trying to make the world better, trying to, do something for your country, however florid you want it to sound. There is an altruism, I think, inherent to it. I used to work for a bank, and I think there is some similarity in terms of the institutionalism, the inertia and torpor of the institution and struggling to get things done. I recognize some of that, but I also, I don't think, and I speak from personal experience, I don't think you can work for a bank and honestly think you are advancing the cause of good within the world, which is why I don't work for a bank anymore.
There is, and you do hear positively with civil servants, often when they're asked, why are you doing this job? The answer, I want to make a difference, does crop up quite a lot. Now, whether sometimes that gets watered down or gets crunched under the sort of realities sometimes of working in a big machinery of government type setup, I think there's definitely something to that.
But Harry, life is complicated. You can have, as we see, Jim Hacker has principles, but sometimes they have to be compromised, and that is the reality. You can have this great altruism, but sometimes you can be having a really crap day and just not do a very good job. The world is not binary. The world is not simple.
And civil servants, like anyone else, will also be thinking about paying their bills. Will be thinking about how can they get the next promotion. Often those kind of things, which are perfectly legitimate, kind of rational things to think about as well. But
and that thing you mentioned before about how there's a danger in opposing something because you're exposing yourself to being wrong, and it's easier to just keep your head down and advance your career. That is not unique to the civil service. That is human nature.
So we talked a little bit about our favourite parts of the series, some bits that we're less fond of. What do you think about the legacy of Yes Minister? Do you see shows that have come after that you see as clear successors to Yes Minister?
Well, look, the obvious comparison is the thick of it, isn't it? So what we were saying before, Yes Minister, although it's in the 80s, is very much that pre-Thatcher 70s political culture. whereas the thick of it is very much post-Blair, New Labour, PR type of politics. And it's a really fascinating comparison. Again, purely just looking at the fiction, the sitcoms, the difference between Sir Humphrey and Malcolm Tucker, I know they're not doing the same job, but the difference between the culture there, the difference between the characters, the difference between the world they inhabit is night and day. It's completely different. Now, again, they're caricatures of reality, but I think it's probably fair to say that working in the civil service in the late 70s versus working in the civil service in the early 2000s would be a completely different environment. Completely different place to work.
From my perspective, I think there would be big differences. I think the emphasis on the media, handling the media, that's always been a big part of the civil service. But with the rise of 24/7 media, online as well, there has been a bigger emphasis on how do you keep control of the story at all times, and how do you not lose track, and having special advisors come in who particularly dedicated, or maybe even just solely dedicated to the media handling. That to me has had a big rise, and it's something that under Blair was recognised, that there was a bigger emphasis on controlling the press. You had people like Alistair Campbell.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember Bernard Ingham. It was Margaret Thatcher's Alistair Campbell, and he was seen as a bit of a bulldog at the time as well.
In a more subtle way, I think that's the interesting thing. Alistair Campbell was very public about his operations, whereas Bernard Ingham was famous for being much more subtle. So there's an interesting thing how perception plays a role in all these.
Yeah, okay. So I was going to challenge you there, Harry, but perception's a better word, I think, because I think perhaps Bernard Ingham did pretty much. Well, I'm guessing here. Bernard Ingham was pretty much the same sort of character, and probably did the same things, but they weren't reported in quite the same way. We didn't have quite such an open culture. You couldn't see the machine whirring in the background,
I think that's right.
There was one other. You asked me about the legacy. There was one other sitcom, which we've mentioned on our program before, which was a sitcom called No Place for a Lady, and this plays into our discussion earlier about equal opportunities. So this was a 1992 sitcom starring Penelope Keith, and she was a Labour MP, and as the title of the sitcom implies, the comedy stemmed from this. Oh, she's a woman. She's an MP and she's a woman. This was 5 years before. I'm going to use the expression Blair's Babes in 1997. It's not the only Westminster set sitcom. There were other examples, but there aren't many. There really aren't that many.
The only other one that came to mind was House of Cards, which is more a serious drama, but the idea of the Machiavellian.
You're talking about the British version.
I'm talking about the British version.
Good.
The kind of Machiavellian operating. Some of that reminds me of Yes Minister. Yes Minister's done in a caricatured comedic way, whereas House of Cards is done in a much more serious way. But I don't know about the timings of those two in terms of which came out first.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. That was outside my remit. It's not sitcom, but I do remember it because I would think that would be a bit later. I would guess late 80s, early 90s.
1990.
It starred Ian Richardson. But anyway, it starred Ian Richardson as Francis Urquhart. And, if you've heard of House of Cards and you're thinking Netflix, it was remade in America many years later. But yeah, it was basically about Francis Urquhart was a politician, and he used skullduggery and literal murder to get to the top. And he was so Machiavellian. It was a really great drama.
I've talked about Game of Thrones a lot. But Game of Thrones feels like I wouldn't draw a direct line to Yes Minister necessarily, but it does feel like it's in a similar category of interested in kind of the operations of government. And you've got characters like Littlefinger and Varys, who are the permanent civil service of the Game of Thrones world. Yeah. They run the small council, and they have their own interests. And maybe you have a Varys who is coming at it more from the good of the realm, altruism, and then you've got a Littlefinger who's probably more in the Anthony J perspective of saying, well, I don't mind about the realm, I just mind about whether or not I'm going to sit on the Iron Throne at the end of it. So these themes just play out, don't they? Even to today. So what about? It strikes me that people often base their understanding of what politics and politicians are like, and we've touched on this a little bit, on shows like this, probably more so often than they do on books or watching House of Commons debates or other things like that. What do you think about that? Is that for better, for worse, in terms of the public's understanding of these things?
For better or for worse? I'll tell you what, before I try and answer that, I completely agree with the premise of your question. I think that, I'm a relatively politically engaged person, but the thick of it is how I think of the Blair era. You know, and I did watch House of Commons debates. You know, I was that nerd. But I think for better or for worse, it's true. People think Alistair Campbell and Malcolm Tucker are the same thing.
The counter argument is that it can then tend to over cynicism, where all politicians are X, Y, Z, and you have a very kind of end of deference approach to politicians.
But you asked, is it for better or for worse? I don't really answer that question. I think it's for worse, but I don't know what the alternative is, because you're not going to get everybody watching education questions. You know, it's just not going to happen. So if we want people to engage with politics, then it has to be made more accessible. And the very act of editing, making things more accessible is a choice, isn't it? It's an editorial choice. And, you know, we're talking about sitcoms here, but it's how the news what the news reports. It's the world we live in. I think it is probably for worse, but there is really no alternative.
Maybe it's for better in terms of entertainment. It certainly is good for sitcoms, but possibly for worse in terms of politics. Which and those two things might always sit in different boxes. So sort of to wrap things up a bit, are there any kind of particular moments or great quotes that you want to point people towards, or even episodes if people were going to kind of give this a go watching Yes Minister?
I mentioned the Series 3, Episode 1, which is the Equal Opportunities one. That's a really interesting one. Series 2, Episode 1 is called The Compassionate Society. And that's the one where they have the hospital, which is open and the most efficient hospital in the country, but doesn't actually have any patients. It's kind of the whole point of Yes Minister reduced to absurdity. So I think that's a really good episode to kind of see how it all boils down.
The other one that came to my mind was there's one called Open Government. It might even be one of the first ones, which is a classic civil servant question. As open government, in many ways, could be really positive, but then has the challenges if you're in government, that it means if you float an idea as a suggestion, then it could be in the tabloids the next day as kind of government is going to do X, Y, Z, all of that kind of things.
That's something you read about a lot as a news consumer. You read about now civil servants, well, not civil servants, but politicians, perhaps civil servants as well, using things like WhatsApp to communicate rather than official minutes and emails, because exactly that, not because there's anything devious going on, but they just want every moment of their thought process to be exposed in 5 years' time, which I kind of get that. I understand that.
Yeah, it can be hard. It can be hard to do the sort of initial brainstorming of putting lots of ideas on the table if you know that your suggestion that was just a bit of blue sky thinking is going to become splashed on the headlines the next day. It's why you talked about Tony Blair. It's why Tony Blair famously regretted the Freedom of Information Act. He says he wished he'd never done that for I think those kind of reasons. Little clips, if people want to do even small clips, because there are a lot of clips that go around about Yes Minister. There's one about the papers.
The only way to understand the press is to remember that they pander to their readers' prejudices.
Don't tell me about the press. I know exactly who reads the papers. The Daily Mirror is read by people who think they run the country. The Guardian is read by people who think they ought to run the country. The Times is read by the people who actually do run the country. The Daily Mail is read by the wives of the people who run the country. The Financial Times is read by people who own the country. The Morning Star is read by people who think the country ought to be run by another country. The Daily Telegraph is read by people who think it is.
Prime Minister, what about the people who read The Sun?
Sun readers don't care who runs the country as long as she's got big tits.
I think that might be our closer.
Maybe finish on that. Well, thanks for joining me on this one, Gareth. It's been great having a sitcom perspective on.
I've really enjoyed it, Harry. It's been interesting to get your perspective on the sitcom as well. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
And thanks everyone for listening. And we'll put information in the show notes as well, links to things, I'm sure. Thanks everyone for listening to this one.